Hey everybody, Bill Bitner here, ZVM Development Lab in Endicott, New York, birthplace of IBM. And I'm here today to give you the ZVM platform update, VM workshop style. Now, what does VM workshop style mean? I don't know, I'm making it up as we go. Now, that's partly a joke, but it's partly about being part of a volunteer organization, right? And that sometimes we don't have a process, but we always figure out a way to make things work, right? And a lot of that deals by just sitting down and talking through things, right? Communicating. And that's one of the more painful things about right now is that I'm not sitting with all of you having that communication and that chat, right? I wish I was, but that's kind of the way I'm going to be having this conversation here. I'm talking to myself, but I'm really talking to you all out there. Now, those of you that are listening to this presentation weeks or months from now, you may want to check out the website here, where the most current version of this presentation will be. That URL will be in the description for you to check out. Okay, so let's talk about what I'm going to cover today. Obviously, a summary of the current releases and the cadence. I'll look at ZVM 7.2, our newest release. And then I'm going to go over what I kind of call our value areas for the product and highlight different items in each of them. And then we'll wrap some things up with just some other highlights and news that I think is important for all of you to know about. So we're going to start out with just the ZVM releases and the cadence of them. This chart should look familiar to a lot of you, right? And so at a high level, there's a new release of ZVM every 2 years, typically in September of even years. It will be in support for approximately 4.5 years. And when a new release of ZVM comes out, we're going to stop shipping new function on the previous release, right? So ZVM 7.2 shipping in September of 2020. We stopped putting out new function in terms of new function APARs, enhancements in the service stream to 7.1. Now, we're still going to keep doing RSUs and corrective service and all that great stuff, as well as when new processor families come out, there'll be processor compatibility support for them as well. But most of our focus is going to be on 7.2, right? And that's what I'm going to touch on today, not just 7.2 the base, but the new function that is going out with that. The other slight difference here that you might recall from previous releases or versions was that when 7.2 became generally available, we still market 7.1, right? So some of you that don't want to be on the leading edge, right? We're on 6.4. You may have wanted to migrate to 7.1, right? So a little reminder there, 6.4 did go out of support earlier this year. So just a little bit of reference information for you. Again, the releases that are out there, 2 of them are currently in support. Others have gone out of support. And then just some reference material in terms of what machines we support with what releases of VM, right? So you can see that architectural level set changing with almost every release. Okay, now we're going to turn our attention to the ZVM 7.2 release itself, right? So 7.2, as I mentioned, came out in September of 2020. There was both preview and GA announcements for that. A key thing is that there was a new architecture level set. So our Z13 and Linux 1 and newer processors there, right? So a little trivia question. I know you guys in the workshop love trivia. There was a Linux 1 processor that we don't support, right? So there was a very small number of machines that when Linux 1 first came out, that actually based on the BC12 machine, right? So that's the machine type 2828, right? And we do not support that on this, right? So there's like single digits of those machines out there, I believe. Hopefully you won't be concerned with that. If you are, let us know. I'm always curious about that, right? It included all the support that we put out to 7.1 in the service stream. So your any logical process support, the great dynamic crypto, virtual priorities queuing, all of that is in there. Right. Some other things to be aware of, some big items, centralized service management is in there, as well as multiple sub-channel set multi-target peer-to-peer remote copy support for the GDPS environment. Adjunct virtual machine support, that's kind of a cool topic if we were really meeting in person for the workshop and had extra sessions to maybe talk about that. But that's basically a capability to have an adjunct configuration inside your virtual machine, right? And so internally we use this a lot to allow debugging going on in the adjunct machine of the primary configuration, right? So kind of some cool stuff there. Really all we did in 7.2 was that technology was there, but it wasn't documented, right? And so when you security folks out there, you can't have stuff that's not documented, right? That's an exposure. So basically in 7.2, we updated all the documentation for that. There are also a number of changes to defaults, both in the mind of security or performance, or so there's some function that was no longer needed, right? As well as some things that were there from a synergy perspective for new function APARs that are coming down the road, right? So some things that we had previously shipped, but we didn't want to change the defaults, right? Because you all told us you don't want changes necessarily in the service stream to affect your environment, right? So we didn't want to change defaults in the service stream, but now that we're at a release boundary, 7.2, it's fair game to change that default. Likewise, foundational changes. So some areas where we know there's support coming, instead of introducing new modules and new control blocks in the service stream, we introduce them here in the base as a term of foundation to what's coming down the road. So really good stuff there. Okay, so now we're going to take our first look at the focus value areas of enhancements and change gears to that. All right, so these focus value areas are 5 of them that I typically talk about, and I kind of think of them as if this was a portfolio, a financial portfolio, we'd like to invest in different things, right, to keep things strong, right? And that's important, right? So the first one is one of the more obvious ones. It's just this idea of improved scaling and TCO. How do we allow and increase the number of virtual machines that can fit in a single footprint for ZVM, right? And things along those lines that allow us to scale up and scale up without increasing the cost of running the system, right? The next category is similar to that, but a little bit different in that this is really about managing resources and managing them for diverse workloads, right? Because I know even though there's benchmarks out there where it's all a set of virtual machines that all look exactly alike or doing the same thing, very, very, very few of you have that, right? If you do, let me know, because I'm kind of curious about what you're running that is just a cookie cutter environment, right? And so these sorts of things are important for us to invest in, that we can have large database virtual machines alongside smaller Java machines, things of that nature. How you're packing with containers, the density of applications. All these different things come into play, and one of the things that we focus on and try to invest in. And then enhanced security, right? Some people say I should have that number one. I kind of put it in the middle because that's a good safe place for it, and everything comes through there, right? So protecting the data, and also from a policy management perspective, items in that area. And then improved resiliency and RAS, so reliability, availability, serviceability, the ability to have scripting and automation frameworks there, things to do problem determination, right? Because we're IBM Z and Linux 1, we don't just say, yeah, that happens, just re-IPL and hopefully it won't happen again, right? We want to be able to figure out what went wrong on all these things. And then lastly, but not least, is improved systems management, right? This includes a lot of different things, but also includes to some degree making sure you that are system programmers or system administrators, making sure you're happy, right? Because in many ways, when I look at the TCO picture of this, right, our first value area, that's all about being able to manage a large number of virtual machines or virtual servers with a small cost, right? And part of that cost is you all that manage these systems. So the more that you can do, the better for the TCO as well, right? So a number of these items wrap into one another, right? But I did select certain things for the different enhancements that we're going to look at next, right? And we're going to start with improved scaling and TCO. As I said, that's a pretty straightforward one. We're going to start out with our first item here, which is something we shipped in February of this year in the service stream for 7.2. And it involves how ZVM simulates instructions that get involved when we're driving a PCIe type device for our guests on top of ZVM, right? And so this is a good improvement for different environments such as Rocky, so RDMA over converged Ethernet and NVMe type devices, right? And as you see here, The graph talks about the number of concurrent connections. In this case, we're talking about a Rocky Express 2 environment, and the response time that we're getting. Now, we know that as we put more and more load on something, often we'll get increases in service time there, or response time. In this case, you see that where the improvement, right, so shown by the red line there with VM 66467, which is APAR for this enhancement. You see some very nice savings there, and they improve as we put more load on the system here. So kind of a nice thing from a scaling perspective. So along with response time, if you're looking at the data from a Linux perspective, you'll also see often the steal time for Linux go down. In addition to this, there's some CPU savings from a VM perspective in terms of what we're doing to simulate that environment. Now, for more information on this, there's a great performance article on our VM homepage there that talks about it. The URL is here, and we'll put it in the description below. Information on that PTF, again, this went out, and it's only for 7.2, right? So watch for that. Another item that shipped earlier this year in March was support for 4 terabytes of real memory. Right, so we effectively doubled the amount of real memory we supported, which is pretty significant. Right, this continues to allow us to support the degree of overcommitment of memory. Right, so if you're running at 2:1 before, right, going from 2 to 4 terabytes, we're now talking about 8 terabytes of virtual over 4 terabytes of that. Right, so good enhancement from that perspective. The per guest limit, that is how large an individual virtual machine can be, that didn't change with this, so that's still 1 terabyte, okay? So a little bit more information on that. You can hear more about it on the new function page. Also, this is one of the items where we had new CP function environment variables introduced. Now, this item is actually a little interesting, right? So with 4 terabytes, this code included the majority of the code that also supports dynamic memory management, in fact, memory reclamation, or dynamic memory downgraded, sometimes referred to as. Right, and so when you look at those environment variables there, you'll now see the limit is at 4. You also see a 1 for this memory reclamation function being there, but the memory reconfig limit, that third variable, is 0. So the function's there, but we restrict you to having 0% of the system as being reconfigurable, right? I'll talk later on, and we will ship another APAR later this year that covers or enables that reconfig number to be non-zero, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, those are those environment variables to watch for. Again, there's some reference information on this item. Again, it went out in March. Again, only 7.2. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit now, I talked about improved resource management, diverse workloads. What this involves is allowing different types of virtual machines to run effectively and well, right? So another item that shipped with that 4 terabyte support back in March was this little improvement called automatic standby memory for guests. So the idea that you have a virtual machine, shown here in the example, Linux 21, where you want to have an initial amount of memory, 4 gig of memory, but you want to be able to go up to 6 gig, right? And then the second statement there, the command defines storage for 4 gig standby 2 gig, indicates that that difference between 4 gig and 6 gig, that's going to be defined as standby memory, right? Defining it as standby memory makes it eligible to be brought in dynamically to the guest without re-IPLing. Right now, let's say we do that, but then we want to increase the virtual machine size, or the maximum size here in this case. So we would change that user statement to have 4 gig, 8 gig, but we'd also have to remember to change the standby number up to 4 gig, right? So the initial memory stayed the same. Now, last example here is with the old style, you would have 8 gig and then 16 gig, right? And so again, here we'd have to remember to change the defined storage, both the 8 gig, that is the initial memory, as well as the standby, right? Now, in the new approach, what we're going to do is we're going to define it like we did before in the user statement, but then the define statement has some new options. define store initial, and then standby is the remainder. Kind of wrap there a little bit on that line. So then if we make a change, all we have to do is change that user statement, right? Define store is still going to be the initial and standby, right? So that statement is still in the directory. It's just what we're changing here. And then likewise with the 8 gig, 16 gig, though I see my big head's in the way of the 16 gig there, right? That works out that way, right? So kind of a little thing, but a nice thing for those of you that are doing those sorts of things. Support for that or information about that, you can find that on the new function page. Also to check if this is available in your system, again, that environment variable for the reclaim support is there. And as I said, it's part of the 4 terabyte support. So it can be found on that same PTF that's out there. Okay, let's talk about dynamic memory downgrade. I mentioned that briefly before, but it is significant, right? And so this allows us to not only add real memory to a running ZVM system, which has been there for a while, but now we can take that memory away. And so this really complements that adding capability. And you can think about a lot of the different cases where we can use that. Now, this does introduce the concept of perm and reconfigurable, right? And so with the support that's going to be going out in third quarter of 2021, will allow you to have 50% of your memory, and real memory is what we're talking about here, configured as reconfigurable. That is, we can take it away from the system, right? With this support, we also have the ability now that you can add memory, right? Well, that actually was there before, but what's different is you can add that memory as permanent or reconfigurable. Now, obviously, once you define something as permanent, you can't take that away and you can't change that to reconfigurable, okay? So lots of different benefits you can think of there probably. Maybe you have a different shift or month-end processing or something like that when you need some more memory. You bring it in and you're fine with that. Some different DR scenarios, I could envision this being helpful. And in this case is where you're using live guest relocation and using that in conjunction with upgrading a ZVM system. So you move all the virtual machines out of a system, shut it down and bring it up with a new service and then move them back. Well, part of what you can do here now is take that memory, move that or take it away, part of that memory away from that LPAR and give it to the other LPARs where you're moving the workload, right? So that we're not putting them as much under pressure. Now, again, some more information on that new function web page. Now, I talked about these environment variables earlier when we talked about 4 terabyte. The one change here is now that limit value for how much memory is going to be eligible to be reconfigurable. That goes up to 50, and that is a percentage, so it's 50% of real memory. Now, that does require newer hardware, right? So Z14, Z15, equivalent Linux 1 boxes and newer support that. So not on the Z13 will this be available. And when this does come out, you will want to look for other things that might be required there. There's some other firmware, because we did a lot of things in this space to allow it to work as well as it does, right? So watch that. There's 2 parts to this. There's a CPPTF, right, that you want to get. And then also there's going to be some performance toolkit changes. You're going to want that APAR as well if you're running performance toolkit. So this next item is kind of interesting, right? So some of you know that we've shipped and support ZCMS, so the ability to run CMS in a Z architecture environment. And we've had XC mode virtual machines for a while, extended configuration, which is a mode that allows you to exploit data spaces in a CMS environment. So one of the primary exploitations there is when you take a shared file system, an SSS directory, and back that dir control flavor of that in a VM data space, right? Now, in the past, you had to make that choice between, do I get the things in ZCMS or do I get XC, right? And so what this item does is allows us to combine both of them, right? So you'll be able to have a ZCMS that runs in XC mode and therefore takes care of dir control data space directories, but it also gives you access to running applications that work with memory above 2 gig, but in many cases, what we really want in ZCMS and Z architecture is just access to additional instruction sets that are present there, right? And so this gives you a lot of benefit from there. Um, Within the ZCMS support, I probably should point out here for those that aren't familiar with it, that doesn't mean that the CMS applications themselves will automatically take advantage of memory above 2 gig, right? It's really just for applications you write or a few other things there, like Performance Toolkit will exploit memory above 2 gig if it's there. Okay, how to get it? Again, go to the new function page. Again, there's another environment variable there. There's a number of different things that went out there, right? So there was some support that shipped for both 7.2 and 7.1. However, the 7.1 support was primarily there for HCD, all right, so that it could take advantage of Z architecture and XC mode at the same time, right? But in 7.2, the full support's there, including Performance Toolkit updates as well. Okay, so now let's shift gears again. Our third value area is enhanced security, right? So our first item here is a little bit of alphabet soup. Shipping in January this year, TLS, SSL, OC, SP, CDP support. And so those acronyms deal with essentially new protocols in dealing with certificate validation, right? And so two of these that are out there, one of them is actually a acronym of an acronym, right? CDP. And what these will allow you to do is, if you have certificates that are built with these, we'll do additional validation that comes into play there. So it gives you that added security. Again, how to get it. There was a PTF that shipped in January, 7.2, not yet on RSU. You will obviously need to apply the PTF and then restart the TCP/IP server. SSL servers, again, would be restarting that configuration with it, right? And so then you would have that and that added security. All right, so next category is resiliency and RAS. And we're going to start out here with another acronym, bowl of soup, MSS, MT, PPPRC, support for GDPS, right? So multiple subchannel sets, right? So the ability to have your subchannels, that address space gets extended because we have multiple subchannel sets there. Multi-target peer-to-peer remote copy is the idea that we're going to do mirroring of this, but in this case, we're not just mirroring the primary to one secondary, but possibly multiple secondaries, right? So you can have a local replica, and then maybe your second secondary is somewhere distance for disaster recovery scenarios, and really intended in some of the GDPS type environments and solutions there. Right, so as I said, up to 3 subchannel sets there that allow that to work. Active configuration, the standby configurations there are configured such. Now, we did do this on a release boundary because there are some changes to some of the externals there to watch for. That support is out and available. Now, if you use HCD in this type of environment, you're going to make sure you have some other support in play, right? And so that's listed here, both from a ZVM perspective, but also from a ZOS. And there's a whole new chapter or an updated chapter in the Planning and Admin book to walk you through what this really means. Now, okay, another curious item here, ZVM adjunct support, right? So this was really a documentation effort, right? So in ZVM 7.2, we've documented it, but the support was actually there for quite a while. And what this involves is the adjunct is really a second virtual machine configuration associated with a user ID of a virtual machine, right? And so it's distinct from the primary one, and it's really intended to do things like run CMS there to aid in debugging, doing things on the fly with that. So primarily used for some internal things that we do, but I can see some vendors might be interested in playing with this as well. It is very helpful in terms of looking at and writing test cases and debug cases with that. But as we look at security and what we've talked about earlier, this was an undocumented interface, right? And so really the primary purpose here was to make sure that everything that we provide is documented. So in a way, I could have put this in the security section. For various reasons, I chose to put it under here in RAS and usability, right? So they each have their own virtual CPUs, memory, and devices, so they can do different things and kind of run independently, but still be connected in the same machine. You'll need to do some things to enable this. Make sure in the feature statement and the config file and or set adjuncts off and on handles that. Okay, Domain Health Checker. This is one that shipped in December of last year. And really was something that came out of our support team, where they looked at a number of cases that we were getting with Domain, and a lot of them resulted in not being defects, but just the fact that something wasn't started or something wasn't configured right. So what they've done is set up a health checker, which you can set up and run in your environment, that does a different set of tests. You can choose which ones to run. You can choose who gets contacted about them, or what degree of impact or failure has to happen for that to go on. Right? If you're running multiple domain servers, you can also determine what runs there and what checks what. So a very nice little item here, and avoid some of those configuration errors that get us all in trouble. Right? And so again, that was available in December, and you see the PTF information there as well. No environment variable for this because it's not a CP item. So I mentioned earlier that systems are getting bigger, right? We went from 2 terabytes to 4 terabytes. With that, we want to make sure that the larger dumps that might be associated with them can be processed as quickly as possible. And so this is yet another item along the series of ones that we've done over the past couple of years to improve I/O performance for dump processing. And so if you're configured to where you're dumping to ECKD devices, so 3390 as opposed to FCP SCSI, in the ECKD cases, we'll take advantage of a high performance FICON if it's available there, right? And speeds up I/O performance from that perspective, gives you a little bit of benefit, right? That also has an environment variable. You can see it there, as well as the support. And again, that went out in February of this year. Now, for those really large dumps, particularly those that include the frame table and the page tables that were present, that can consume a lot of memory. And so one of the things that we came up with was the fast ZVM dump distiller, right? So a way to create a much smaller dump, transmit that to IBM. Since it's smaller, it's going to FTP a lot faster. IBM can take a look at it, maybe see if it's a duplicate of something that's a known problem. Just allows things the actual analysis to get started a little faster, right? Meanwhile, if we really need the full dump, we can be processing that in the background and sending that forward. Now, important to note, this doesn't make the time of the ab-end go any faster, right? Because we're still taking the full dump. It's just a matter of processing on the back end, right? And so again, a new function page item for that. One of the things to note that might get overlooked is even though we've been recommending dump load 2 for large dumps for processing and so forth, this new option is only on the dump load module, right? So you want to look for that there. Again, February of this year for 7.2 that this went out. All right, so let's go on to our last category here, and that's improved systems management, right? Making system programmers happy, making the system easier to manage it is important. Goes back to TCO as well. So one of the things that's in the base of ZVM 7.2 is centralized service management, right? And this is the scenario where we want to be able to apply service and manage it easily in one place, but then is effectively put it into production remotely on many systems, right? And also to varying degrees, be able to manage those distinct levels of service, right? I know in many of your shops, you could be in the process of rolling out multiple levels of service, right? Maybe in your sandbox, you have the very bleeding edge. In some of your non-prod, maybe a back level from that. And then in production, you're going to wait and roll everything out to that eventually, right? And so this is a great approach for that. Part of what's going to be involved here is there's going to be a principal system, right? That's going to be where we manage all this, and then you'll have your remote systems. Things are going to be connected and transferred over TCP/IP. We have some unique FTP servers set up for that with this support. Now, it's intended for a non-SSI environment, right? So if you're using single system image clusters, you already essentially have a flavor of this within that 4-member cluster, right? So in many cases, this is really meant for a much larger number of systems, right? I guess for me, kind of the break point is somewhere around 8 or 9 systems is where I would consider this pretty well, because it does require some setup and some configuration to do this, right? It's not rocket science, but it is a little bit more work. And if you don't really need all this new capability, that may not be necessary. So just take a look at that. It's important to understand that. Okay, so another item here, and I've kind of referenced this several times here already, is this new function interrogation API, which shipped in October of last year, so in 2020, right? And many of you came and said, Bill, what's going on? You keep shipping all this new function. How are we supposed to figure out what's on our system, right? Well, that was a good question. And so what we did with a great sponsor user engagement was introduce this new function interrogation API, right? And it's going to work off of environment variables, right? So we had previously, when we had shipped environment variables, we talked to you about some reserved names. And so that is cp.function.something, right, is where these environment variables are going to live that are related to function, right? And we're starting this with ZVM 7.2. That's why it shipped relatively early after 7.2 G8 in September of 2020. Right, there's a URL and web page here that documents all the variables, right? And as you can see, there's different things there, information about, well, what APAR introduced this, what are the variable names, what are their options. You can sort and look for that in multiple ways. So good feedback on that. Hopefully you'll be using that and get benefit out of it. Again, that was the APAR that went out. It's not yet on an RSU, and there's the new function web page for that. Spool information enhancements. I'll go fairly quickly over this one. Really some things that we did for some of the products that run on top of ZVM, in particular Operations Manager, so it can understand and get spool information better. Right, and so that shipped March of this year. Again, there's an environment variable for that that indicates that it's installed. So CP query device is a new command that we introduced back in December of 2020 for 7.2, driven by customer requirements, obviously. This is interesting in a couple ways. One, it addressed the problem of we give you multiple ways of dealing with devices and dealing with them and configuring them dynamically. But in some cases, we didn't give you a way to check as to what the settings were, right? And so unless you caught like an error message or remembered exactly what you had done, there wasn't a way to check it out, right? And so this introduces that, right? So whether it be a devices statement in the configuration file or one of these commands that are issued here, one of the various set commands that did it, we now give you information about that. The second reason why I found it very interesting was we've worked with sponsor users for quite a while, ESP customers in the past, before that, but this was a case of where we actually had not just system test kind of level testing, but CFT testing, right? So a number of customers working with us and with our CFT folks who wrote test plans for them. The customers executed those test plans, allowed them to test in a lot of different configurations that would have been far more difficult for us to configure. And in some cases on some hardware that we didn't have readily available to us, right? So it was kind of a win-win there, and it went really well. So this is out there. Again, the new function web page, another environment variable for it, and where the information is. Guest one-to-end Hyperpav Alias, right? So Often we want to avoid giving guests access to cylinder 0 for various reasons, right? And so in the past, if you wanted to have Hyperpav aliases configured in this type of environment, you had to give them the full pack, right? Or indicate the full pack was there, right? And so the requirement came in that, well, can you skip cylinder 0 and just give me 1 to n, right? And that's effectively what this does, right? So it protects that real volume and allocation information, right? Here are the commands, examples for that to give you an idea of how to do that. And again, information that's available on that. December of last year is when this shipped. So we've been talking a lot about the control program or the hypervisor proper. Also Performance Toolkit, which is a priced feature of ZVM. Got some enhancements last year. Some additional reporting on SMT that's pretty significant. So various new reports, right? All the information about thread density, maximum capacity factor, those type of things that are important from a overall core or logical processor perspective are now available. Also, for virtual machines, as you may know, there's really 3 ways of looking at processor time consumed by these virtual machines. There's just the pure raw time of counting the CPU seconds used, something we call MT1 equivalent, which kind of says, well, what would processor time be if it wasn't running SMT2? And then prorated core time, right? Because for your scenarios where you're doing charges based on core or with software licensing being core based, we want to get a sense of even though the processor was busy a certain percentage or the core was busy a certain percentage, what part of that or what portion of that was each virtual machine responsible for, right? And so now Performance Toolkit displays that information and a whole lot more, right? So again, you can go to the website, get some more different information for that. Again, 7.2 for the Performance Toolkit feature. All right, so I won't unpack all this, but just to remind you that the infrastructure suite for ZVM is out there. It currently supports or contains 4 products. So Megamon XE on ZVM and Linux, right? So remember that includes both the agents for the ZVM hypervisors as well as an agent for the Linux running on Z or Linux 1. Spectrum Protect is the second item there. Operations Manager, which I mentioned kind of briefly there, is kind of the bread and butter of doing operational management, automation, monitoring and alerting there, as well as some spool file management. Backup and Restore Manager for ZVM is the last one there, and also the virtual, the tape manager for ZVM is available as well. That's not part of the infrastructure suite, but you can also get that. And all of them are up to date and in support of ZVM 7.2. IBM Cloud Infrastructure Center. I used to call it the new kid on the block. It's not that new on the block anymore, right? It's been out a while, and they've had several new releases that come out. Again, they're on a continuous delivery model as well as ZVM and some of the other things I mentioned, right? So, so some neat things that are there. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to take a look at it. Again, it looks like my picture's in the way of the email address, but we'll make sure that gets in the description below if you want to read that later on. So IBM Cloud Infrastructure Center is, as its name indicates, supports ZVM and other platforms from an infrastructure level, right? It also has capability to tie in all sorts of other things in VMware or OpenStack, Ansible, different things that are available there, right? So look for that, some neat stuff. All right, so that kind of wraps up our value statements, but let's take a look now at a few other highlights I want to call your attention to. First off, I know some of you out there are members of the ZVM Council, right? That's something that meets monthly for 90 minutes in WebEx, and we talk about all sorts of stuff. There's something similar to that for the Linux environment on IBM Z and Linux 1 called Compass L, right? And so there's a lot of information here. Again, I'll try to get that URL in the description below, so you can take a look at that. It's a free of charge. Unlike the ZVM Council, where you need a feedback program agreement from a legal perspective, This does not require that. Now, that also means that we won't be spilling beans like we do in the ZVM Council, but it's still a really good group to be a part of. I know they're looking to expand and do a lot more there. So check that out if you're interested. All right. One of the items that we shipped late last year, or not really shipped, but we made available was we updated our website for the support section. And what you see here is the new page that's there, and you'll see it has a number of tabs, right? So there's an overview tab that just gives you some background about support in general. There's a tab there for preparation, right? So this is kind of your checklist of things you want to make sure that you've done before you even have a problem, right? Do I have enough dump space? Am I preserving my consoles? Do I know how to get monitor data? All those sorts of things. Then there's this troubleshooting tab here, which has a series of different categories on this table, and it'll kind of walk through of what kind of problem do you have? Is it performance? Is the system hung? Do I have a network problem that involves the TCP/IP stack? And for each of them, if it does, what actions should you take, and what data is IBM likely to ask you for? Right, so some great information there in terms of helping you get started when you do have a problem, right, as you're waiting for IBM to get back to you, which hopefully shouldn't take too long, but you can be looking at what to collect there. Now, if you want more detail on those items, right, you're not maybe familiar with how to collect MonWrite data, that fourth tab there, the must gather tab, that's going to tell you all about that, right? It'll give you some hints and tips and things to work on that. And then the last tab there, sending data, just gives you some reminders about how and when to pack the data, how to send it in, things of that nature. So good stuff. Check out that website and let us know what you think. It is a work in progress. We've already added a number of new things to that for other categories of problems, right? And thank you to those that have given us feedback. All right, another thing kind of along those lines is out in the ZVM Council, there's an educational work group, right? And we've started to create some how-to guides, right? That's part of our mission there. We'll be doing other things, but the how-to guides are starting to roll out there. And you can get to the playlist on YouTube, or also there's an IBM page that has some of that information that we'll make available at a point in time, right? So it's actually hosted on the IBM Support and Training YouTube channel. It's not just ZVM specific, but there is a playlist there. And again, we'll get that URL to you down below in the description. All right, so hopefully you got something out of this. Again, I'm sorry I'm not talking to you face to face, but maybe next year. I feel really good about what the team's been doing, and there's been a lot going on, right? We shipped a very solid 7.2 release. Knock on wood, but the quality and the feedback has been positive to date. 6.4 did go out of support, right? So if you haven't already gotten off of it, you want to do that. 7.2 is a good option to go to if you have the hardware to support that. Watch the new function web page as we ship more and more things. That's the place to find out about it, right? So subscribe or follow the website that I've referenced throughout this presentation for the latest news, and we'll give you updates on that. So with that, I thank you for your time. I hope you're well, healthy. I hope your systems are running fine, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now. Glenn, what are you doing here? This is my presentation. Yeah, I know. Well, like I said, what are you doing here? Bloopers. There's no bloopers in this. We're not doing a blooper reel. Yeah, we are. Well, why do you say that? Because I got them. Roll film. And that is an improvement for guest PCIe type environments, right? And what this involves is an improvement to how ZVM stimulates. No, we don't stimulate, we simulate. Now, with that, what we used to do is often use this command called define. Crap, that's wrong, isn't it? I think that command's wrong. Cut directories, right? So the best of both worlds from that perspective. they're what is there? I don't know. And so the first item here is acronym soup, right? So we're talking TLS, SSL, OCSP. See, I said it wrong. Possible. So one of the items here is something that helps improve environments where you have your dump space configured on FICON CC, CCD, CC, CC, CC. Okay, another fun one here. MISS, MISS, MISSIPP, no, MISSISSIPPI, Mississippi, there. This was our first item where we really looked for our sponsor users to do a function level test, right? So with help from our CFT testers, CFT testers, that's redundant. Why would you say that? But I guess it's not the new kid anymore, right? So IBM Clown, and did I just say clown? I say clown. Yeah, I'm a clown. So many of you have heard about the ZVM Council, right? And what we do there, meeting once a month and 90 minutes. There's a new group, the Compost. I just called it Compost. It's Compass, Compass. I'm looking right at it. Why can't I say Compass? It's Compost. Now Jens is going to be mad at me.